All right, we're going to start that stream over. I'm just going to kill the other one. I was trying to adjust the sun so that you guys could see, and the phone managed to come entirely off. So that's not super helpful. You'll have to forgive if it's a little bit wobbly. But here's what I want to get across. Right now, as I speak, the 35th of 5/31/2020, we are on our fourth night of, I think it's the fourth night of rioting. Unrest has spread to more than 24 cities in America. And while they're being called protests, and while they are in fact riots, I would like to posit to you that what we're looking at is the opening battle of a fourth generation civil war. Depending on whose definitions you use, you break warfare into first, second, third, fourth gen. But what we're really talking about is a low intensity conflict, not fought between large masses of armed people in easily identifiable battlefields. So what we're going to talk to you about, like a fourth gen war, would be a low key internal conflict, much more like you would think of as the rebellions or the resistance movements in other nations. And there's a reason for that, and that's because the architects of this conflict have been steeped in that ideology. They're reading Rules for Radicals. They're the intellectual children of Saul Alinsky. They've benefited from the result of all of the information and ideology about causing chaos and destabilizing governments that the Soviet Union pumped into the American left through the 50s and the early 60s when they made their deliberate action to take over the institutions of higher learning, to push left-wing radical ideologies that were sympathetic to violent rioting and destabilization tactics. And then, you see that the DNC, the left, has a long history of favoring these sorts of tactics anyway. The KKK movement, the radical, violent enforcement arms of the 60s. This is all the same pattern where the left wing of the United States, just like the left wing all throughout the world, sort of creates these slightly deniable militaristic armies whose job it is to punish individuals and municipalities that step out of line. So if you take an action that the left really doesn't like, what happens? Spontaneous riots come and burn down the center of your town. And you wind up with municipalities that just roll over. They step aside and they allow these people free rein, in part because the leadership of those municipalities also are part of the left, also agree with it. There's a reason why this happens on the left. So what you're seeing is sort of the flowering of decades worth of work to pre-position these violent cells throughout America and create a political party, the DNC and the left, who even their moderate members have become conditioned to condone, excuse, and step away from the actions of the violent terrorist cells. There's a reason why Antifa groups have trained with Syrian terrorist training specialists. These are terrorist cells. There's no way in which they do not fit the organizational and ideological definition of a terrorist cell. So what happens? What do we actually really see going on? What we're seeing is these cells doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Pre-positioning weapons. We have these videos of pallets of bricks conveniently positioned in the small morning hours in front of the targets, just there so that the protesters can have them. We see these cells providing legal representation. These cells are providing advice and tactical backing. We see these cells providing water. They're providing medical care. They're providing transportation, busing the more militant groups around. And we know that these groups are tied together, and we know that they're tied to the DNC. We have the undercover video of them admitting it. We have the social media connections. We have the DNC candidates and party members openly spending time with the leaders of the Black Lives Matter and Antifa groups, the most militant parts of that. So you have this sort of network of prepared violence. And why now? Why is it coming to the front now? You would think it has something to do with George Floyd, but it doesn't. You might argue that in the 60s, a case like Floyd being, Floyd's arrest would have divided the nation between people who thought it was good and people who thought it was bad, but there was no division. Literally everyone thought it was bad. And in the swiftest way possible, the federal and local and state governments acted to figure out what happened and hold the officers to account. No, what you're seeing is a left wing that is desperate to fire the ammunition they have because they know that it's coming to an end. They thought they had it with Hillary, and when Hillary lost that election, they had to prematurely launch their media and social campaign. So all the media that they'd been building up, all that credibility that they'd spent decades building a twisted media that was showing you a funhouse mirror of the world, they had to activate that wing. And the result, the media has lost all credibility. So the second part of that was to maybe find a way to force a sort of communist, socialist economic revolution. They tried that twice with Bernie Sanders. The second time, it became clear the Sanders revolution wasn't going to work. They had to put Sanders aside. And what did they do? What do you do with a failed communist social ideology when you see an excuse like COVID-19? You take your best shot at destroying the economy, destroying capitalism, putting everybody in their house, and then sort of forcing them to accept government handouts as a substitute for work. And you try and blame that on a virus. And when that doesn't work, when the American people get fed up with that, then you find the first convenient excuse you can, and you see if you can destabilize the government and force martial law. You do that by activating as many of these cells as you can, and you bring out rioting. Now, when I say you do it, I don't mean that there's one guy sitting in a room with 5 other people smoking cigars going, activate the cells. No, it's more decentralized than that. But as we've seen through the workings of Middle East terrorist groups, social media can bring out coordinated actions by decentralized groups of like-minded individuals. So you gather together and empower groups of people with very similar ideologies, very similar moralities, very similar ethical boundaries or lack of ethical boundaries. And then you use social media to coordinate their actions. You get a neural network style effect where people act in concert, even if you would have trouble drawing a specific organizational chart. And this is what the DNC has been funding. And why now? Because we have an election coming up, and they thought they owned it. But we're coming out of COVID-19 with people desperate to start in on capitalism, with people desperate to get back to work. The media has lost its ability to move the needle, so the media arm is gone. The attempted coup as far as the economic situation failed. The attempted, authoritarian push with the left-wing states trying to take over the lives of their citizens under the guise of public health. It turns out the citizenry is rebelling, and that's falling apart. So while you have the reins of authoritarian power, before you lose the last vestige of your emergency control under COVID-19, what can you do? You riot. You see if you can extend it. So you see if you can get that to happen and force a federal overreaction that will bring about an actual shooting civil war before the election, but it's not going to happen. It looks like Donald Trump was too smart for that. It looks like the public sentiment is turning. Antifa is being seen for the radical left-wing extremist terrorist group that it is. I know it's fashionable right now to pretend that Black Lives Matter as an organization is different than Antifa, because then you get to talk about left-wing extremists and avoid the sort of racial overlay component because Antifa is overwhelmingly white. But the reality is the Black Lives Matter movement is no different. It's simply racially more diverse. It has the same tactics, the same pre-positioning of weaponry. They have, the same history of rioting, the same history of violence. So as much as it's tempting to go, we're just going to take on Antifa and not BLM and sort of sidestep the accusation of racism, the reality is you're never going to be able to sidestep the accusation of racism anyway. But more than that, there is no important division. All right, we'll talk about this more. I just wanted to get this video up and out while I had the time. Stay safe tonight. It's not going to get any better for a little while, and I will talk to you later.